1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
It's the 10 Cut Commandments. What?
What's up, world? I am your host, Kamal Nuru, a.k.a. Zo Mega Millions. You're watching BWTV, the podcast, episode 18. It's my pleasure to introduce my brother, Dr. Zaid Muhammad, affectionately known as Dr.Z. Welcome to the show, brother.
Hey, thank you for having me here, Kamal. How you doing, brother?
I'm great, brother.
That's my man.
I thought it would be a good idea to invite a psychologist.
You know, I'm a school psychologist.
School psychologist,
Thank you,
right?
brother.
And I say that because barbers always talking about, you know, we're barbers, we're friends, we're family, we're psychologists to their customers.
And they are. They kind of are.
So I thought it would be great to have a real psychologist on the show. And let's just talk about the state of what goes on in the community and the things we do talk about in the barbershop. So welcome to the show. And Zaid, tell the people out there at BWTV where you from.
Well, I'm from Harlem, New York. I want to thank Kamal. Kamal, there are different types of psychology. There's clinical psych.
Right.
There's community psych. And I would fall under the school psychology, which is a very specific certified field. We'll talk more about that.
Right.
And community psychology just by research and by background and what I've taught in the university. But I'm from right here in Harlem, brother.
That's right.
And I'm glad to be back here.
You represent the H.
That's right.
So what inspired you to become a psychologist?
Well, in a nutshell, I wanted to have a front row seat to all of the things that affect our children,
Right.
and any child, you know, of any background, but especially from what I saw in Harlem. Anybody who grew up in Harlem in the late 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, when I was already a young adult, have seen the same things that I saw and wanted to know, how does that kind of stuff, be it addiction or, you know, just, you know, having to survive in ways that tore the community up, how does that kind of stuff get started? And get a front row seat to that so that I could figure out how to reverse engineer those maladies and figure out how to help people. And school psychology was the best way to do it. I started out wanting to work in the prisons, actually. And I had a good mentor who I worked with who advised me to think about changing people who are already who are still growing, right?
Right.
Who haven't already crystallized some of the things that they're struggling with in adulthood, right?
Right.
Go back and work with those who are still growing.
Right.
And so that's what brought me into at least wanting to work with children and work in the mental health field. And then on the educational side, I said, but I want to do something like this in schools.
Right.
And then that's when I discovered school psychology and, you know, slowly went into that field and got a doctorate degree along with a master's degree in school psychology. And I could have gone the hospital clinical psych route, that's state licensed
Right.
profession, or the school route. And I was a fish in water in schools, and that's where I've been ever since.
And your mentor, what's your mentor's name?
Okay, so I've had several mentors through the years. I've worked under Dr. Anderson J. Franklin, who's a prominent black psychologist who worked on a study regarding the resiliency in black men. And he worked on that study ranging from older teenagers to elderly men from the South. And so as I worked in that lab, you know, I got to talk a little bit about getting serious about the profession. I worked for the phone company at the time, and he said, well, you know,
while
if you
you were
get
in
serious
school?
about this, yeah.
Right.
You know, if you get serious about this and want to take a direction, A, go for your doctorate degree.
Right.
We need a lot of young black doctors out there, but not just to have the title, but to do the work. And B, you know, consider working with children. There's a lot of work to be done with the people who are coming out of the system, people who are already adults. Matter of fact,
Right.
we'll talk about some of that work in terms of the empowerment. But work with those children who could really use your help.
Right.
And I listened to that.
So with working with children, can Can you share what school did you work with children in?
Sure. So, I mean, did my, well, I worked in New Rochelle during my training years. In, I worked in right here in Harlem, PS 200. I worked under a school psychologist there as a certified school psychologist at that time.
Right.
Still training. And for those of you out there who are interested in school psychology and who speak Spanish or who are bilingual, I was a part of what's called the Psychologist in Training Program. That's through the New York City Department of Education. And that program is now designated and earmarked for those people who are bilingual, but still working with children in our communities. So I went through that program even as a certified psychologist. Right. And then once I finished my doctorate, I landed a job working downtown across the street from Stuyvesant High in an elementary and a middle school there.
Right.
The elementary school children in that area are from that area, so I don't necessarily get to work too much with our kids there. But the middle school offers a rich opportunity to work with those kids who are coming from throughout the city.
Right. So tell me, what's it like, and what are the challenges being a psychologist for kids of those ages?
Right. So, the biggest challenge in being a school psychologist is you have walls, you have boundaries, right? And much like your experiences in business, you have to accomplish a great many things with the limited resources that are available to you. In schools, and working as a school psychologist, working as a professor, or just working your own business is the same thing.
Right.
And so the first challenge is, you can't save the world, so how do I carve out this small slice of people who could use some of the help that we offer by providing assessments, looking at what needs should be provided in accordance with those assessments and the results, reaching out to the community and teaching the community what some of the needs are, going beyond the schools, even sometimes for time that isn't paid, in order to rally support for certain groups of students, and then ultimately creating programs in schools, all with limited resources. That's one of the bigger challenges. And the other challenge is the institutional rigidity of, I don't want to just say this school, but any school system.
Working within the school system.
Yeah, you have to work within the system, and part of that requires you to be a little bit street smart in what you're doing and be able to figure out how to manage a great many needs with a limited amount of resources and work within the system and work with the other personalities. And that brings me to the last challenge. And that you got to work with the people, man. You got to establish, what the real currency is. It's not money. It's not funding. It's not big space, right, to work within which you can work or build a program.
Right.
It's the relationships.
Right.
And figuring out, excuse me, who the players are, and working with those individuals. And they don't share your interests until you share your vision. And once you share your vision and you share it in a way that makes sense and create that buy-in, being able to move forward with that vision and help them to help other kids and families.
Now, when you work in the school system, do you work with the kids that are, I guess, they're suggested by the teachers or the facility to see the psychologist?
That's right. And so typically the role of a school psychologist may not necessarily involve seeing the children for services, but picking those children up, or let me take a step back, working with the teachers, working with the administrators to find out, collect data, figure out what's happening with the child, with the family. There are multiple systems, Kamal, right? So figuring out what could be impacting the education for this child and just the all-around development for this child, from the family system, from the system of friends, that circle, from everything to what's inside the child. How does he eat? Does he eat bacon for lunch and breakfast every day? I mean, that has a way of impacting his cognition. Did he have potato chips and Captain Crunch for dinner every night, right? Is he struggling with disabilities that come from within that are organic, that he was born with? Is that person being abused, right? So on and so forth. So once so here's typically what happens: a referral is made.
That come from the teacher? Or?
It can come from the teacher. It can come from an administrator, that being a principal. It can come from the family. And sometimes for older children, it can come from the child.
Right.
And then the referral then moves toward evaluation.
So what are the signs that would trigger them to move from one point to a referral?
So what are some of the things that we notice? And I got into a little bit of that, right? Well, does this child perform on grade level? Right. Does this child...
Is that the first sign?
That isn't always the first sign. That's one sign. There are multiple signs. Behavioral things. Is this an outgoing child that is suddenly, down and out? And I should probably mention that there are even processes before a special education evaluation, as we call it. And that is something that New York State and the rest of the country should have, called the response to intervention. So making certain that a child gets support long before we evaluate the child, just to see, okay, how are they responding to the services that are provided if they're at this place where they're at risk because of those behaviors, because of those learning challenges in the classroom or social challenges with peers. And if that doesn't work out, once we go through all of the tiers that are involved, then we have to look toward evaluating. This is a great model because in the past, back when we were growing up, if a child was evaluated for special ed, they've already failed, right? It's a wait to fail model. So what are we doing for these kids and for the families before we get to that point?
Right. So once they're referred and they see you, how does that work?
When a child is referred, there's a multidisciplinary team process. There are multiple people that are involved in making certain that child gets what he or she needs, all right? So a social worker, for example, would meet with the family to get the full background for that child. We could meet with one parent or meet with a multitude of caretakers. The teachers would provide background information from the classroom. Here has been the pattern, right? You may have other related service providers, occupational therapists, counselors, who may give their feedback on what they've observed, all right, and may be involved in providing those types of assessments. And then finally, a school psychologist would sit down and evaluate the child, and that would involve any special education evaluation would involve psychoeducational assessment with social and emotional assessments, with intellectual and cognitive assessments, and in some school districts, educational assessment. And in other school districts, a special ed evaluator may evaluate the achievement in learning skills and learning styles.
So at times, you say you get to work with our people in the elementary school, you said?
In the middle school.
Middle school, right. How much of it do you think has to do with maybe, post-traumatic slave syndrome?
Well,
do you see that any common issues with those kids?
Okay, great. So, let's talk about, we're talking about African American children, yes, children of African descent, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the other children of color, but let's start with the children of African descent first, right? So these children are not just, they're not growing up in a vacuum. They're growing up in the context of the developmental systems that I described for you earlier. Mm-hmm. Those systems developed in the context of the historic background of a culture.
Right.
That culture in America developed in the context of not just slavery, but post Civil War, antebellum South, civil rights, the Reconstruction, civil rights movement, the migration north, and these children, these families this entire culture is impacted by all of that.
Right.
So with that with that logical chain of events and factors all linking into one another, a lot of these children are impacted, I believe. And this is a strong conjecture, but I strongly believe it, are impacted by some of those same forces that shaped their conditions in the first place, their
Right.
families' conditions
Right.
in the first place, and absolutely impacts learning. And let's take it a step further. Maybe not just post-slave syndrome, maybe not just race-related stress, Sean Utsi, maybe not just the invisibility syndrome, A.J. Franklin,
Right.
and maybe not just racial microaggression, Thoreau Wing Sue, but let's just talk about the risk factors that comes with a family, and this is a lot of children of color from urban backgrounds, a family who doesn't have wealth, doesn't have a cushion of any kind financially, socially, a mother that's on her own. And so you have a child who has to, travel to the middle school whereas their more well-to-do counterparts and white counterparts live right there in that area.
Right.
They have to travel to the school. Homework suffers for a lot of reasons. A 1 hour commute on the train is a 1 hour commute on the train. It's not possible to get homework done in the same way as if you're walking down the block.
Right.
And then if you reach school and, probably hungry, rushing in, a little late for breakfast, and then on top of that, dealing with the social maladies that you've grown up with or that are in your home, and not all of them have it. They're lovely homes, but they still have to deal with challenges in those communities. It absolutely impacts learning.
And okay, you evaluate these children, right?
Yes.
So, what's the ratio of return on time spent and energy, maybe, and how often, or do you subscribe to medication as well, suggested medication? How does all of that work?
Thank you for that. So I almost never talk about medication in schools, and I make certain that none of the educational professionals, or even the school nurse for that matter, if he or she happens to be involved in a case, delve into medication. The only people that should discuss medication with the family are the pediatric professionals, the medical professionals that are involved with that child, be it a nurse practitioner or the pediatrician or a developmental pediatrician, child psychiatrist, child neurologist. And there are a number of reasons to get medication, right? Because you have some children who have spinal bifida and they have other conditions that would afford them special education services, whether they're black, white, or any color. And those children need to be medicated, whether, as it relates to their services, whether whether the family reaches, whether the family talks about medication or not with the school. That's really just a part of their being able to function well and access the curriculum. But let's talk about the kids. I believe we may have, some idea. Those children with ADHD, for example.
Okay.
All right.
Explain what that is.
All right, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a condition that impacts learning by way of the attentional factors and the what we call executive functioning, wherein a child's ability to control and inhibit impulses, a child's ability to plan and coordinate, and basically look at the world and make rational, logical, well-driven, or decisions that are driven by all of the information given to them, and to regulate their body. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is the impairment of all of that.
Well,
so those kids.
Go ahead. I just want to go ahead.
No, those kids when they have when they've been diagnosed with ADHD, and they're in front of us for an IEP. Should we talk about medication? The short answer is no.
Right. So and that's that title for the condition.
Right.
I'm sure when we grew up, they didn't have that title.
Right.
You know, we would call them sugar babies or hyperactive or
Right.
whatever it was. And I don't think there was any medication at that time, you know, for it. So you see it, you hear it more often nowadays. And I asked you in regards to the medication and the school because one of my barbers that works in my shop,
Right.
you know, it was pushed on him for his son through the school, you know, so it came down the line of the school. And that's why I was wondering, you know, I guess is it the policy or of a school to decide whether they should be involved in that way? But he was feeling the pressure coming down from the school because, and is there a difference
Right.
from boys? Because usually that goes hand in hand with male children.
Right.
And is it any, you know, similarities with a young boy just being hyperactive, being, you know, just distracted, or the school not being able to keep his attention? Is there what's the ratio of, you know, that ADHD being with young boys,
Right. Well,
in comparison to young girls?
well, I got you.
Okay.
Okay, so there is a higher proportion of boys that are diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I wanted to say something about that though. It doesn't mean that girls don't have it, but they're underdiagnosed, especially you know, girls of color versus boys of color. Boys of color can be over-identified with ADHD. All right.
Why is that?
Well, there could be a number of reasons for it. So let's start with the most obvious. Some kids may, by virtue of the symptoms that they have it. Let's just start with that.
Right.
Sometimes, by the way, schools don't diagnose, and they shouldn't.
Right.
And there is no disability classification that would name a child with ADHD. There is a classification that would fall under, but schools do not diagnose. And if I could speak to that barber really quickly, schools should not be pushing medication. So getting back to this question, so what are some reasons that a child would be identified, right? And so that's one. Another is sometimes that child may be suffering with other conditions and mistakenly classified with ADHD. That child may have fatigue and doesn't have ADHD at all. Remember I told you about the kid who has to commute on the bus? Well, what does it look like if you have a child that barely sleeps at night and shows up to school and has to perform, and, you know, in order for him to keep himself awake, he's got to keep himself active, all right? What does it look like if a child at his early age is taking in caffeine to keep himself awake because he's so tired?
Right.
All right, so, I mean, there are just a number of ways that a child may get identified with ADHD, but here's the proper way. Data from the school, data from the home, and that data has to concur from the school and the home with multiple reporters and multiple sources. Neuropsychologists are able to not only evaluate a child based on their cognitive strengths and weaknesses and educational strengths and weaknesses, but also their neuro-cognitive functioning. I told you what executive functioning is, and you could look at that in some very specific ways. There are instruments out there to measure executive functioning. There are instruments out there to measure attention. And I'm not just talking about the rating scales. I'm talking about a child being able to sit in front of a computer screen and respond to stimuli in ways that would tell us whether or not they are impulsively responding or not. So there are very legitimate ways to diagnose attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The wrong way to do it is for people to just say a child has it.
Right. And, you know, me being a barber, having multiple locations, dealing with multiple personalities,
Right.
as far as the barbers that work within the shops and the clientele. Now, there's a lot of grown adults that, I mean, I would be one to say that we all have issues.
You
some
better
of
believe
us
it.
wear it on outside. Some of us
Right.
wear it on the inside. Some of ours are just more recognizable than others. Some
Right.
of us can hide it. But so I just see behavior and things that go on in our community that would say, do you think if some of these people got help as children, how might that help them as adults, and is it the effect of them never getting help?
So it's interesting. We had a conversation here about ADHD. Adults can have that. It's
Right.
not just kids.
Right.
So, and now there's somebody out there saying, brother just said adults can have it. What does that look like? Well, I'll tell you. Do you miss bills often? Are you the one person who can never make it in on time? Do you get so angry at something that is no big deal and you explode, and then immediately after you feel remorse because you didn't mean to, but you couldn't stop yourself? Do you have a hard time keeping the house clean, being organized? Right?
I mean, a lot of people, y'all gonna be raising your hands right now. They be like, now you got all of us saying, damn, do I have ADHD?
And the key is, do you have a number of those things at the same time? Not any one of them.
Okay.
Do you have a number of them at the same time? Now, far be it from me to diagnose ADHD. School psychologists don't do that. But I'll tell you one thing, and to answer the next part of that question is, it's never too late to get support for something. And you didn't ask this, but I'll share it. It doesn't have to be medication.
Right.
And it can simply be a support group. It can simply be awareness. It can be understanding if your child has symptoms of ADHD. Do you have to run out there and get a diagnosis? No. But are there strategies for dealing with that? Sure. Are there benefits to getting a diagnosis? Yes. And can a good school psychologist that cares about our community tell you what those are and empower you so that you're not exploited? Absolutely. I do it all the time. All right. And that's some of the work that overlaps with some of what we see, what we've seen in our community.
Right,
all right?
right.
Making certain that people are not misled or misguided about ADHD. All right. So I mean, listen, Kunjufu was right all those years ago, 30 years ago, when boys were over-referred for ADHD.
Right.
There has been a shift, Kamal, where children who get what's called a Section 504 plan to get accommodations for tests in school so that they're not unfairly judged based on conditions, and children who obtain what's called an individualized education plan through the special education process have shifted in such a way where more privileged, wealthier children are using those same programs to ace tests to get into Ivy League schools, to pass the GRE, to pass the SAT.
That's what happens with most of those things.
And our children are no longer being given these programs. So there's a whole litany of rhetoric out there that says our boys are over-referred. That may still be true in some pockets of our communities, but I could tell you right now that they're being under-referred so that they don't use the educational benefits that are there to advance.
Right. In your opinion, the differences between ADHD and people say they're bipolar. What's the differences?
All right, so bipolar disorder is a mood disorder, all right? ADHD is a neuro-cognitive disorder. That's ADHD is more or less a disorder that involves, like I said, cognition, executive functioning, attention. Bipolar disorder really involves mood, and there's a fluctuation between what's called mania and what's called major depressive episode, and someone who has bipolar disorder, and they don't necessarily have to have depression in order for them to be diagnosed with bipolar, but mania and hypomania. And just for our viewers out there, mania involves that elevated feeling that you have that you could conquer the world and almost do anything, almost always followed by a crash. And feeling so down, just to use common language and keep it plain for our people, feeling so down in the dumps that nothing could cheer you up, all right? And all that comes with depression.
Right.
And all that comes with those mood disorders.
And how might one understand how to do something to help his or herself, who might say, okay, I see myself in this area?
Okay, so let's start very grassroots first. We were talking about mood disorders,
right,
and what one could do if they feel like they may fit into that category.
Right.
Now, the first thing is, without even having to self-diagnose, self-awareness is important. How do I feel? Why is it hard to break this sadness? If it's just depression, do I feel like I could conquer the world 1 minute, and then the next thing I know, I'm getting a flood of phone calls because I spent more money than I should have, and I dipped into an account that I should not have because of the impulsiveness that comes with mania. Have I slept with a person that I really didn't mean to sleep with, and I wasn't drinking? So a lot of these things that would tell us whether or not there are symptoms of a mood disorder in one extreme or the other. And that's what bipolar is. The polar part of it are the extremes of mania and depression.
Like they say, opposite polar ends of this.
So being self-aware, asking important questions, having a good support group, and surrounding yourself with people who have some sense. And part of the reason that's important is because much in the way that you wake up in the morning and look into a mirror to see how you look in the morning, your mirror socially are the people around you who care about you, who can tell you the truth about what they've seen.
Right.
And then finally, there is no shame, and I can't say this enough for our community, there is absolutely no shame in getting the professional help for what you need. Because listen, there are so many psychologists out there of all colors that care greatly about helping people with these conditions, and if we narrow it down, there's a whole community of Black, Spanish, Asian psychologists of all colors out there who care about communities of color and people of color and helping you to get through these issues without exploiting you.
Suggestions for people who are involved with someone who may have some of these symptoms,
Okay.
whether ADHD or bipolarism, suggestions on how one could approach their mate or their child, and just, if they're noticing these things,
Right.
and people are not self-aware, how does that look? How would that, how do you suggest to approach that?
The reason I think this is an important question, and it's a great question because a great many of us, and I don't have any statistics on this, but you could bet your bottom dollar that there's a lot of us who are in relationships with people who are struggling with mental health symptoms or who have been diagnosed, and it's just hard for them to deal with that. And some of them are even getting treatment. If I had to sum it up in one word, it takes a lot of patience. And maybe it isn't just bipolar disorder or, anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder or attention deficit disorder for any stage. Or maybe it isn't just schizophrenia or personality disorders. Someone who's just like, why does this person not care about anybody but themselves, right?
Right. Narcissists,
people who may be a little more sociopathic. Listen, it could, if anyone is struggling with these things, it takes a great deal of patience. It also takes, I think, a volume of information. You have to acquire that information in order to help guide yourself through understanding it, right? And this is assuming a person wants to stay, right, with this person.
Right.
It's going to take a lot of understanding. Right. And part of the reason we struggle in our community, and I'm going to speak for the Black community, from a lot of different maladies, I could sum it up in 2 words: knowledge gaps, right? We don't know a lot of the information that's available to us that would help us to not only be better informed, but make great decisions around some of these conditions and relationships with people who have these conditions. But the other part is we don't know what we don't know, right? Yeah. Being able to get knowledge and being able to do a self-assessment and say, okay, well, what are some of the ways that I can deal with this? And there's so much literature out there on how to, in pamphlet form, that's easy to digest, on how to live, for example, with a spouse who has bipolar disorder, and what to do when they're in their upspike and what to do when they're downtrodden, or how to deal with either a child or a spouse who has symptoms of ADHD, and how to sort of cope and how to wander, navigate that field with them, because it's one thing we can remember, it's more difficult for them than it is for us.
Yes. And that, this is Barber World TV, so I always kind of want to pull it back into the barbershop in one way or another. And I just noticed that I've had barbers who have worked in the shops, and the way they commune with one another, I listen. I'm always finding myself trying to be the mediator, the coach,
right,
giving my advice, pushing them to see beyond what's right in front of them, the bigger picture. I'm not diagnosing anybody, but
right,
there's certain people that show those traits, and they've shown. I'm not one to throw the baby out with the bathwater,
right?
But I know that there's guys that are in my space that they don't get along with people. They always having issues, and it's different forms of that within 7 locations, and being in business for 20 some odd years, I've had to deal with that a lot. And it's a common thing. And that's just what my barbers in the store. And that's just a microcosm of what our community looks like.
That's right.
How we can't get along, or we don't get along. I wouldn't say can't, but we don't get along, and we find ourselves fighting one another and making bigger issues out of things that are small. And it's it's serious, and sometimes I'm at my wit's end trying to let them see that it's not that big of a deal. And, things are blown out of proportion, small things. And it's hard to be in business and survive when it's like it's turmoil
right,
sometime within there. And it's like, this relationship doesn't have to be with a spouse. It could be in the workplace too.
Absolutely, in the workplace. It can be with your children.
Yeah.
It can be with the people who work for you. I'll share an interesting story, something that I observed, and then we'll go somewhere with it. But see, one of the reasons I admire you, Kamal, is because you're in a space where you may have somebody who's never had to listen to anyone else a day in their life, and who have served a lot of time in prison, maybe 2 years, every 2 years throughout their life.
All right.
Who is completely oppositional when it comes to authority. And how do you relate so well to these individuals that you could get them to sweep a floor? Here's a person who's, committed crimes and didn't give a what.
Right.
And yet you could take that person with gang tattoos who could care less and get them to sweep a floor and get them to listen to you for a half hour on a specific technique to cut ahead.
Right.
And you know what that comes with? I think when you care enough about the people who are around you, it allows them, it gives them the rope they need to pull through some of their issues to get close to you and hear you. Right. Now, microcosm is the right word. I'm glad you used that word, because by now, with your 20 years, you've probably cut close to 10,000 or so heads or more.
For sure.
And you probably worked with hundreds of barbers. Yes. And with that, and those heads came from a variety of communities. So you've seen all of the dynamics that life can bring in any given society. Yeah. And a barbershop is a snapshot of all of it.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, we recommend that parents bring their children in any culture, especially your male children, to a barbershop, because that is a crash course on how to survive in the world. Right. When we were growing up, there was no appointment for the barbershop.
Right.
You had to go in there and advocate for yourself, right?
Yeah.
And push through the personalities and push through the issues that people had. Right. The reason people come to the barbershop, and I'm glad that I'm here on World TV because I'm going to share this with the world. The reason people come to the barbershop is not just for a haircut. People come to the barbershop much in the way that people go to a nightclub, or for the reasons that people go to a social gathering or a family reunion. People go to the barbershop not just for the haircut. They stick around hours after the haircut.
Yeah.
They go to the barber because there's somebody there that cares about them and that'll listen to anything that comes out of that mouth, even if it's crazy, right? So here's the key, man. We could utilize that leverage, that degree, that open gate to empower those individuals that walk through that door, no matter what their condition is.
And that leads to my next question. The barber seeing his psychiatrist, right? What advice would you give a barber to, if he noticed some of these things in his clientele, could be a young child, could be an adult, to help them, in some way, words of advice or pointing them in the right direction? Because I'm sure, and as barbers, people come to us and lay it all down on the line for us. And we have clients that we know for years. And, they confide in us like going to the Catholic Church and you know what I'm saying, going in that little box and speaking to the priest. They confide in us that way as well. And I think if they had something, that some advice or some way to approach the situation, because they have our ear and we have their ear. And there's times that barbers are asked advice in critical situations.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the funny thing about advice, it's free, and I think it's important, especially in oral tradition cultures. And I once sat with a colleague who said, I do not want to hear some grandmother telling their children, giving their children advice about mental disorder. And so one of the first questions I had was, well, why not? Because if there's knowledge on that particular thing, and you can steer somebody in the right direction and move them towards seeing somebody that can truly help them, why not let the advice be the pipeline to the support that a person truly needs? So, for example, when your grandmother, and I'm talking about the collective Black and people of color community, when your grandmother gave you advice, be it the Vicks Vapor Rub or the potato on the wound or whatever it was, whatever home remedy to alleviate pain. And some of it worked, some of it is folklore. But there's something to be said about communicating with a person what you believe could help them. So if you have somebody, for example, who's explosive and rageful, why not, while cutting that head, be able to tell that person without any pretense of being a mental health professional, yes, and in all honesty, my good friend, telling you this because I love you while I edge you up here, at some point, somebody's going to get hurt and get the help you need. There's no harm in it. Anger is one letter away from danger. It doesn't take any training to share that with somebody.
That's right.
Right? And so I think that's important in our community. And I think that the barbershop has an important role. Okay, do you remember the Barbershop Quartet?
Yeah.
Okay, you remember that was a program in place to teach men about cancer. The barbershop can be the one place, it can be the canon that allows us to teach people about mental health as well.
Exactly. I mean, because people are more likely to share things with their barber than their doctors.
Right.
So we can definitely be that first assist to point them in the right direction. So whether it's pamphlets or whether, you leave your information and they can start with you for a referral, You
Right.
know, that's what it is, you know?
That's right. And, I always like to say, and I'm not the first to say this, a good mental health professional worked with someone inside of their head. A barber works on the outside. But you know something, there's still an opportunity for partnership in that regard.
That's right.
And I'm a strong advocate for mental health, not just in schools, but in entire communities and the systems beyond the communities that impact children who and in their learning and their mental health issues. And so with that, I share this with you out there in barber world. If you're cutting hair, if you have a barbershop, be not afraid to ask that gentleman who's sitting in your chair that you know is a social worker or a psychologist or a school psychologist like myself or a psychiatrist to share that information.
Right. Thank you. So, any other projects that you're working on?
So one of my favorite things to do, Kamal, is to teach in the university and disseminate this information. And here's the interesting thing about that. I've transitioned a long time ago, and my students have helped me do that at the graduate school level as well as the undergraduate level, from simply teaching the information with expert dummy model. I'm the professional. You don't know anything. You're the student. Do what I tell you to do. Take the test. Go in the back of the textbook and look at the glossary words and prepare for the test.
Right.
We've moved away from that, especially since I teach in the CUNY system, and we're teaching, again, mostly college students of color of all ages. Some of them are our age, right? And so I've moved into an empowerment, into empowering students and teaching them, hey, there are skills that you can pick up that go beyond what you're learning, even right here in this class from the textbook. Right. We have symposia. You'll be speaking at one in the near future. We have symposia, which allow a panel to talk about issues in the community related to the content that's discussed in that course and taught in that course. And we also have I'm starting to teach students how to take what they're learning here and share it with the world, be it on the online platform or YouTube or in a blog of their own.
Right.
And so, speaking of which, I partnered up with a really good friend of mine, Dr. Sophia Miranda, and I created and we together co-founded what is called the Consultation Tower. Now, the Consultation Tower is a one-stop shop online platform that uses behavioral health solutions to, quite simply, empower people who have had a hard life. And that could be any variety of things, be it somebody who've had a great life until they got divorced, or someone who grew up in poverty, or adult children of alcoholics and drug addicted parents, or adult children of dysfunctional families who, even though they're functioning well and doing well in life, when they go home at night and they shut the lights off and they close the doors, they hurt. Right. Because that pain, it's indelible ink. That pain that they experienced years ago is just as fresh today. And so our platform, our blog, which will also have a service platform as well, provide at this stage information to help people to get past that hurt, to empower them so that they can live an improved and empowered life.
And how do they find the blog? Is it on the website?
Very simple, consultationtower.com. Consultationtower.com. If you type it in Google together as one word, the website will pop up.
Great.
Home of the Empowered Life movement.
All right, thank you. Is there a number, any contact number, or is that the main way of contacting you?
That's the primary mode of communication, is just to join that site and subscribe, and then you can communicate with not only me and Dr. Miranda, but you can also communicate with the other professionals that are there. We have 2 other school psychologists. And just to say another word about the site, one of the groups of people who have had the hardest life are single parents. So, for example, the Consultation Tower is the one place where those single parents can buy a book that empowers single parents, Parables of a Single Mother, and also read the number of articles that we have on empowering families who've gone through those hard times. So subscribe to that blog and you'll be able to reach out to any one of us on that blog.
All right, brother. Thank you. It is a lot of information. We're gonna have to have you back because there's a lot to cover in one sitting. But thank you for your time, man, and thank you for the information.
Kamal, I want to thank you, and I just want to say that this is like a ministry. This is important work. Not just what you're doing here in this room with the microphone and the cameras, and this is important. I'm talking about your work as a barber and a business owner and as a family man. All of that comes together to help you to be a beacon of hope for people who are looking for it. So congratulations to you as well.
Thank you, brother. And in closing, life is life, love is love, loyalty is priceless.
Peace.
I've been cutting these heads for years. It made me a master. There's rules to this shit to get money faster. A cut by cut booklet for you to get your game on track. Not your lines pushed back. Rule number uno.